Okay, so just to go over again the very last point I made, that there are machloksim in the Mishnah itself, whether certain Sefarim belong to Kisvei HaKodesh, Tanakh, or these Sefarim are excluded from Tanakh, meaning to say the Chachamim actually debated these issues, and surprisingly there are some opinions that we don't paskin that way, that certain Sefarim in our Tanakh are not considered to be Kisvei HaKodesh. Now I had said at the end of yesterday that the way the Chachamim describe the question is they discuss whether the Kisvei HaKodesh are metame your hands if you touch them, or they're not metame your hands. Meaning, if it's holy, it's Meta'im Es HaYadayim. If it's not holy, then it's not Meta'im Es HaYadayim, right? So you take a novel, the novel is, maybe it'll be Meta'im you, but it will not be Meta'im your hands. Meaning to say, I could eat Truma while I'm reading John Grisham, but I can't eat Truma while I'm learning Kisvei HaKodesh. I'll discuss what that actually would mean, because it's Metame Yadayim, and I can't. And the halacha is you cannot eat Truma when your hands are tamei unless you wash your hands. Again, the reason is because the Chachamim were gozer on unwashed hands that become tamei, that they're like a sheni l'tuma. A sheni l'tuma is Metame Truma. Okay, again, let me go over this briefly. It's not really our sugya, but just a little bit of an introduction. Again, if you learned the Gemara in Masechah Saita about this, which is very, very complicated, you would get a bit of an idea here. Here is the thing. A mace, which is the most chomor level of Tumah there is, an actual dead body, is called Avi Avos, the father of Tumah. And that's the only one that's Avi Avos HaTumah. But other things that are primary sources of Tumah, primary sources, are called Av HaTumah. So an example would be a dead animal, Shichvas Zera, the blood of a nida. These are called Avos HaTumah. So let's take a dead animal that wasn't, by the way, by a dead animal I mean that wasn't shechted. An animal that's shechted, so if you eat hamburger you don't become tamei. But in the vela, if I touch a piece of non-kosher meat, I'm tamei. Now it doesn't make a difference for us because we're tamei anyway without parah haduma, but this is an av hatuma. Now, here is the basic rule. The only thing that is metame a person is an av hatuma. So, if you have a dead animal that touches an apple, the apple is tamei, the apple is called a Rishon l'tuma. If I touch that apple, I don't become tamei at all. Because I, as a person, can only become tamei from an av hatuma. A Rishon l'tuma cannot be metame an adam, but a Rishon l'tuma can be metame another ochel. So if the apple touches a pear, the pear is a sheni l'tuma. Now, if everything is chulin, non-consecrated food, that's as far as it goes. If the pear touches a piece of bread, it's tahor, because a sheni cannot make a shlishi in Tumah, in chulin. On the other hand, if the piece of bread is truma, truma can become tamei up to one generation. So truma can become tamei if it's from an av, like a dead animal touches the truma, or truma can become tamei from a rishon, or truma can become tamei from a sheni and it becomes a shlishi. But if the shlishi touches another piece of truma, that other piece does not become tamei, because chulin goes up to sheni and no further. Truma goes up to shlishi and no further. Kodshim, karbanos, go up to Revi'i. So if you were dealing with lechem apanim or something, that could even become tamei from a shlishi. A shlishi is isa Revi'i, but even by kodshim, a Revi'i cannot make chamishi. That's as far as it goes. And in terms of being metame a person is only tamei from an av hatuma. A person is not tamei even from a rishon l'tuma. Okay, that's the basic rule you need to know. Which means to say, by definition, a person can only become a Rishon, because if I become Tameh from an Av, I become a Rishon. And if I become a Rishon, I am Lagamri Tameh, it's not just my hands. But the Chachamim were geyser Tumah D'Rabbanan that certain things are Metameh Yadayim. But the status they put on Tumas Yadayim is a sheni. It's an artificial sheni, which would therefore mean unwashed hands that touch Truma, since they are a sheni, make the Truma Tameh. A Truma that's Tameh cannot be eaten. So in a sense, these are two synonymous statements. Yadayim Sheniyos Hein is one way to say it. The other way of saying it is Yadayim Poslos Es HaTruma. That's saying the same thing. Since Yadayim are Shniyos, they make Truma puzzle if you touch it. How do you remove Tumas Yadayim? You remove Tumas Yadayim by Netilas Yadayim. So again, be sure you understand the difference between Netilas Yadayim for bread and Netilas Yadayim for Truma. Netilas Yadayim for bread is only for bread. And that's a separate Takanas Chachamim. But for Truma, because your Yadayim are Shniyas, you have to wash, even if you're just going to eat a Truma apple, and you have to wash, even if you're just going to touch the apple, you're not even going to eat it at all, you cannot touch Truma until you do Netilas Yadayim if your hands are in a state of Tumah. So, what makes your hands tameh, right? That's going to be a big question. So there's a lot of different things that can make your hands tameh, but one of them is kisvei HaKodesh. And I had mentioned that the reason is because people would keep their kisvei HaKodesh with their truma grain because it was holy, and the mice would eat the grain, and the mice would make holes in the sefer. Therefore, the Chachamim said, don't keep it with your truma because it'll make your hands tameh and the like. So they don't care if the secular novel or whatever gets eaten up, but they do care that the kisvei HaKodesh not. Okay. Now today, this is largely not nogeya so much because our Kohanim don't eat truma anyway. But still, theoretically, the question would become, what do we mean that kisvei HaKodesh are metameh es HaYadayim? Does that mean only if it's in a scroll, only if it's a klaf, like we read the Haftorahs? Or does that even apply to a printed book? Right? What about Tefillin? If I was a Kohen and I touched Tefillin, would that be metameh my Yadayim? Right? So there are different machlokim exactly what are kisvei HaKodesh. Now, there are some achrayim, the Chai Adam actually says, we're not noyig this way, that the din that kisvei HaKodesh make your Yadayim tameh is not only nogeya truma, it even applies to Netilas Yadayim at a meal. That according to him, says if you touch tefillin during a seudah, you have to wash your hands again. And according to some, that would mean even a printed book, which is an amazing thing. That's an amazing chumrah, because that would mean every time I'm learning from a chumash or a book of Nach, I would have to wash my hands. Learning from Gemara wouldn't be a problem because Gemara is not kisvei HaKodesh per se. But that's a chumrah of the Chai Adam that he applies the rule of Tumas Yadayim even to the Netilas Yadayim over bread. We don't paskin that way. We only apply the din of Tumas Yadayim, Lagabi Netilas Yadayim for Truma, which is not Nogea Lamaisa today because no Kohen today eats the Truma, and all Truma is considered to be Tameh, Bizman Azeb. Okay. Alrighty. So that's a complicated background, but therefore when the Chachamim consider a sefer to be Kadesh, Metameh es HaYadayim, when they don't consider the sefer to be Kadesh, it's not Metameh es HaYadayim. So based on this, in Maseches Yadayim, which is towards the end of Seder Tahiris, which is a small Maseches, a very interesting Maseches of 4 prakim that talks about Tumas Yadayim and Netilas Yadayim. By the way, as an alternative, and this is both true for Truma and even for bread, instead of washing your hands, Netilas Yadayim, you can actually be tovel your hands in a mikveh. I'm not sure that'll ever be easier per se, but theoretically, sticking your hand in the mikveh, not your whole body, just your hands in the mikveh, is considered to also be valid, but you make a different bracha. Instead of saying al Netilas Yadayim, you make the bracha al Tevilas Yadayim. So next time you wash your hands in a mikveh, remember that you have to make the bracha in a different, there's a different nusach for the bracha. Yeah.
Would this apply if you were out in the countryside and like eating bread by a stream?
Yeah, so really the problem is this. The problem would then become, is a stream, a river or a stream, let's say, is it a kosher mikveh? And that's a difficult question. Let me give you a little background on that. It's not only nogea hands, it's nogea a woman has to go to the mikveh or whatever, can streams and rivers. So the problem is basically this. In order to be a kosher mikveh, generally speaking, the water has to be stationary unless it is coming from a natural gushing stream. Now, the problem with a river is the following. If most of the water in the river is from rainfall, it would not be kosher because it's moving water, unlike a lake. If most of the water is the subterranean spring that's feeding it, it would be kosher because spring water is a valid mikveh even if it's moving. So Chazal basically say rivers are kosher for tevilah in the summer months when there's no rain. So whatever water is there is coming from the spring, and river waters are not kosher in rainy seasons because we're choshesh that most of the water is rainwater, and if the rainwater is not stationary, it's not going to be kosher. So all I can tell you is the stream may or may not be a kosher mikveh. If it is a kosher mikveh, it's a valid tevilah for Netilas Yadayim also. If it is not a kosher mikveh, it would not be a valid tevilah. Okay. Now, so that's just the introduction, that when you see Metam'im Es HaYadayim, you understand that that is a canonization controversy, whether something is within the canon of Kisvei HaKodesh or not. Yeah.
Can the ocean be a mikveh?
The ocean can be a mikveh, yeah. Even though it's moving, but it's considered to be going back and forth. That type of movement is not the same as a river. In fact, I mean, there are many situations where sometimes people are traveling, they're in a city without a mikveh. Can they go to the ocean? Of course, the problem is that a nida in particular normally goes to the mikveh at night. And at night, it can sometimes be very dangerous with currents. You don't know what you're seeing and the like. So then you discuss the halacha, whether that would be a reason to allow going in the daytime. Yeah.
Halacha, she has to go at night, or that's just
No, halacha, she has to go at night. Absolutely. Well, okay. Let me put it this way. She can go in the day, but it has to be after 7 days. Meaning, the earliest she could go is the night after 7 clean days. So she would not be allowed to go the 7th day. It has to be the night after the 7th day. Now, once she's past that, she can go in the day afterwards. Yep. But then she would be delaying her immersion. Okay. So, interestingly enough, I'll mention a few in which there was a machlokas. Shir HaShirim was a machlokas. Some said Shir HaShirim is romantic love poetry. How could that be a holy book? The great savior of Shir HaShirim was none other than Rabbi Akiva, who said, if all of the songs of the Tanakh are holy, the Song of Songs is the holy of holies, because it is a metaphor, it is a mashal, it is an allegory for the love of God for the Jewish people. And that is the halacha, obviously, how we accept it. The book of Koheles, which is also attributed to Shlomo HaMelech. There were Chachamim who didn't consider Koheles to be holy because it contained statements that if you read them superficially, might look like kfira. Koheles talks about death. When a person dies, there's nothing left. Meaning, again, if you read it literally, it might be a denial of resurrection of the dead or Olam Haba. So it's how you interpret it. So Koheles, Shir HaShirim was an issue. Now, strangely enough, this is going to be a different implication. Megillas Esther was a controversy if it's nichlal in Kisvei HaKodesh. is Megillas Esther Metam'im Es HaYadayim. But here I want to suggest to you that the controversy of Megillas Esther, it could not be the same controversy as Shir HaShirim and Koheles. Let me explain why. Let's assume you took the position, which we don't paskin like, that Megillas Esther is not metame your hands. It's not nichlal in Tanakh. Let's assume you took that position. What does that mean? Does that mean you didn't read the Megillah on Purim? Meaning, how did that opinion, which is an opinion of Tanaim, how did that opinion celebrate Purim? They didn't have a Megillah reading? That's probably not the case. So here's the point by Megillah. Everybody's moda that there's a chiyuv midrabanan to read Megillas Esther. So in that sense, it's a holy book, but it's not considered kind of a prophetic book, meaning it's not in Kisvei HaKodesh, but it's like a tefillah or a shevach or a hodah or a praise of God. So unlike, you see, the Mandi Amar that said Koheles and Shir HaShirim were excluded, they actually took the position that there was like something wrong with them. The exclusion of Megillas Esther is not because there's anything wrong with them. It simply was not a Kaddish book, but there still was a chiyuv to read it on Purim. Right? Otherwise, it doesn't make sense that they didn't read Megillas Esther on Purim. Now, even a book of such a well-established Navi as Yechezkel, one of the big Nevi'im, there were opinions who wanted to exclude it from Nach. And the reason is that in the latter chapters of the book of Yechezkel, when he talks about the third Beis HaMikdash and Korbanos, he gives a whole sacrificial avodah that is totally different than the Seder avodah that's laid out in the Torah. It's as if he is changing the halacha, and a Navi is not able to change the mitzvah. So there was some thought, that some opinions took the position, that Sefer Yechezkel was a heretical Sefer. Again, we don't paskin that way because the Torah Shebaal Peh gives us reconciliations and answers to make it consistent with the Torah. But this is just an example of controversies. Now, how late did these controversies go? I mean, listen, if we see that Shir HaShirim was a machlokas, and Rabbi Akiva was the one who defended Shir HaShirim, so that's pretty late. Rabbi Akiva lived after the Chorban of the Bayis Sheni, and Rabbi Akiva died when Rabbi Akiva was tortured to death because he was teaching Torah. This was in the aftermath of the Bar Kokhba revolt. Now, just to give you a little dates, the Romans destroyed the second Mikdash, the normal year that we give, although people debate about it between 68 and 70, but the normal year that's given is 70. Okay, well, let's go with the normal year. The Bar Kokhba revolt was finished. Rabbi Akiva died in the year 135. So Rabbi Akiva died, we would say, how many years is that? 65 years after the Chorban. Now, if you remember, just to remind you, the historic period covered by Tanakh ends a few years after the building of the second Beis HaMikdash. Now, the second Beis HaMikdash lasted for 420 years. And Rabbi Akiva was killed 65 years later, which actually means that final decisions about Kisvei HaKodesh were not made until almost 500 years. You're following my years here. 500 years after the period of Nach ended. Which means during those years, there were some uncertainties I mean, again, not the Torah, not most of it, but there were some marginal uncertainties regarding the holiness of certain books. In other words, final canonization did not occur until around, again, I don't have the exact years for this, but until around the time of Rabbi Akiva's death. Again, I can't say his death per se, because all we know is he was involved in a canonization controversy. So in his life, there were still controversies regarding Shir HaShirim, Megillas Esther, Yadayim, and the like. Now, if there are controversies, if certain books were in or out, and we're machriya that these books are in, of course, that is what the Chachamim paskins. What about, were there any books that were candidates for inclusion that were excluded? Right? The Mishnah only tells us which books got in when there's a machlokas. Were there books that were considered that were out? The answer is absolutely. And indeed, Chazal refer to these books as Sefarim Chitzonim, the outside books. Outside of what? Outside of the canon of Tanakh. They are not books of kedusha. And the English, actually it's the Greek word for this is the Apocrypha. Now, the books of the Apocrypha were written during the Second Temple period. So Rabbi Akiva had these books. These books were known. They weren't written later. And people were debating, would they be included? Would they not be included? And they became the Sefarim Chitzonim, just like the word Brisa, right? The word Brisa literally means outside. And that just simply refers to teachings of the Tanaim that are not included in the Mishnah. Of course, Brisas are still Torah Shebal Peh, but they're not in the Mishnah. Brisa, outside. So, Sefarim Chitzonim are the books that were written during the Second Temple period or even earlier that were not deemed holy and not included. Now, so the word apocrypha actually means hidden books, because we're going to see that the concept, so Chazal didn't use the word hidden books. Chazal used the word outside books, but I'll explain how it got connected to that. So it's interesting. It became a borrowed word that's not used in its correct sense. When we talk about a story that's not true or may not be true, we often say in English, the story is apocryphal. Now, that is taken from Apocrypha, which was considered to be not true. But really, Apocrypha does not mean not true. Apocrypha means hidden or concealed books. But since they were excluded because a lot of them were not true, so it became a borrowed word. Apocryphal meant something not true. Yeah.
What's the halachic mechanism to decipher which?
Yeah, so this is a little difficult, because the normal understanding is that the canonization decisions were made by the Anshe Knesset Hagdola, which is much earlier. They were the beginning of the Bayis Sheni, Ezra and Nehemiah themselves. But if that would be the case, how do you have a machlokas in the time of Rabbi Akiva about Shir HaShirim? So apparently we would have to say that this was not a final process, meaning to say most of the Sefarim were canonized and makubal and approved and certified by the Anshe Knesset Hagdola. For reasons that are not clear to me, some Sefarim were in a state of limbo until a much later period. The process would simply be, and again, we don't know b'diuk how this worked, a convocation of the Chachamim. Now, maybe it was the Sanhedrin, maybe not. By Rabbi Akiva's time, it's not clear what you had. And the Chachamim would have an asifa in which they would decide. Right? So we have Shir HaShirim, Koheles, we have the book of Yechezkel, and even Megillas Esther. There was a controversy regarding its status as canonization. Now, the Sefarim Chitzonim are called the Apocrypha. So it's interesting. Lahavdil. The Catholic Bible actually includes apocryphal books in their Old Testament. Right? The Old Testament is what they call Tanakh. So in the Catholic Bible, you actually have the apocryphal books, which means they treat it as the same as the Jewish Bible. In the Protestant Bibles, they don't have the Apocrypha, or maybe they'll print it as an appendix, but they will not include it. So I have to say that the Protestants are, in this case, are more faithful to Jewish tradition than the Catholics, because we do not regard the Apocrypha as part of Tanakh. Now, the Apocrypha itself is a whole bunch of books. So what types of books are in the Apocrypha? Are you allowed to read the Apocrypha? Right? What's going to happen if you read the Apocrypha? So the truth of the matter is, the Apocrypha is a wide range of different things. The largest book of the Apocrypha is Sefer HaMaccabim, the book of the Maccabees, which goes through the story of Hanukkah in great, great detail. By great detail, I mean it describes every battle, all sorts of people, gazillion people. It'll give you more information than you might care to know about, unless you are a person who is interested in military history, because it actually goes through battle by battle, hill by hill, inch by inch, all of the different intrigues. In fact, there are 4 books, just like there's Malachim Aleph and Beis, there's Maccabim Aleph, Maccabim Beis, Maccabim Gimel, Maccabim Dalet. So there's Sefer HaMaccabim in 4 Chalakim. There is a book that is called the Book of Ben Sira. Now, the Book of Ben Sira is very, very similar to the Book of Mishlei. Like Mishlei has proverbs about living a life of tzidkus, righteousness, etc. Ben Sira has the same types of things. And yet, it's so interesting, Mishlei is Kisvei HaKodesh, Ben Sira not. Now, are you allowed to read these books? So the Gemara in Sanhedrin brings a mimer of Rabbi Akiva that says, anybody who reads the Sefarim Chitzonim does not have a share in Olam Haba. Keep away from it. But the problem is, the Gemara itself will sometimes quote Ben Sira, and the Rishonim will sometimes quote the Book of the Maccabees, the Gabi Hanukkah stories and the like. So how could that be? How could the Gemara quote Ben Sira, which is from the Sefarim Chitzonim? How could Rashi and other Meforshim quote Sefer HaMaccabim, Sefarim Chitzonim? So the answer has to be that you have to understand that in the large category called Sefarim Chitzonim, there are actually subdivisions. Some of the books, in other words, the common denominator is they don't have kedusha. Yeah, that's what it means to be Sefarim Chitzonim. They are not works of kedusha. That's fine. But within that common denominator, there are subheadings. Some of the books are considered to be historical books. The Book of the Maccabees, there is nothing in the Book of the Maccabees that's heretical. There is nothing in the Book of the Maccabees that's kfira. The Book of the Maccabees is a historical discussion of Antiochus and his rule and the revolt against Antiochus. So when Chachamim said you're not allowed to read Sefarim Chitzonim, they were not referring to the historical books. I mean, if I could read a book of history, I can read a book of this history. And the Rishonim considered that to be a reliable source of history, which it is. So category 1 are books of history, which are not Kadesh, but they are still considered to be legitimate sources of history. Category number 2 is books of musar and morality. That would be Ben Sira. Ben Sira in its Tochan is more or less like Mishlei, but it was not written with special divine inspiration. So the Chachamim maintained, but it is still a work of Chachma. So that itself is also going to be mutter. One could read Ben Sira as a musar book, a musar sefer. So those two categories, although they are Sefarim Chitzonim, are not nichlal in Rabbi Akiva's warning, he who reads Sefarim Chitzonim, ein lo chelek liolam haba. But there is a third category of Sefarim Chitzonim that were excluded not simply because they don't have kedusha, but they're still valid books, but they were excluded because the Chachamim determined that the ideas that they espouse are against Torah. And therefore they're what you call treif books, books of destructive hashkafa. Many of them might incorporate Christian beliefs. Many of them incorporate Avodah Zarah beliefs. An example with this would be Sefer HaYovelos. There are different books. If you ever look just at a table of contents of Apocrypha, you'll see different titles there that try to espouse demonology and various other aspects, which are Keneged, our Messiah. So they're Sifrei Kfira, right? So we have history, which is okay. We have musar and ethics, which is okay. And then we have Sifrei Kfira. So the problem of Sefarim Chitzonim is not that they're Sefarim Chitzonim, but why were they excluded? And that may be important. They may be Sifrei Kfira, and Rabbi Akiva is warning us not to read Sifrei Kfira. So again, just to be aware of this, if you're reading Sifrei Kfira in order to refute them, then it's mutter. It's like reading any sefer of Avodah Zarah and the like. So these are the Sefarim Chitzonim, and again, they are available online in all sorts of different translations, so it's not a secret where you can find them. But these are the Sefarim that didn't make it. So we have controversies about things that did make it, and who knows? I'm not even sure if there were. See, this is interesting. I don't think in Chazal there is any record of a controversy that what became a Sefarim Chitzonim would be admitted. I'm not sure if they had any advocates at all. That would be very interesting. Like, was there anybody who felt the book of the Maccabees ought to be included in Nach? I don't know. In other words, those that got dumped into the Apocrypha, there is no record of any Manti Amar that was arguing for their inclusion. We only have a record the other way, that those books that were included, there were some opinions that wanted to exclude them. Okay. All right, so that's kind of the idea of the Sefarim Chitzonim. A little word about Ben Sira that Tosfos brings in Chagiga. Literally, Ben Sira, his name was Yehoshua Ben Sira. But Tosfos brings that the word Sira is Aramaic for seer. Samach Yud Resh. Seer means a basin. And Tosfos brings an amazing wild medrash that the actual father of Ben Sira was Yirmiyahu Hanavi, but the mother was a single woman who accidentally conceived from the zera of Yirmiyahu that was in a hot mikveh. In other words, there was a seminal emission, and she was nisabra biambati. She got pregnant in a bath, right? Essentially artificial insemination. And the son that was born from that nisabra biambati was Ben Sira, which is why he is called the son of a basin, of a washtub, a bathtub, and the like. And the poskim discuss biarichos that this is one of the earliest sources of a pregnancy through artificial insemination without intercourse. And the Medrash says, there's a Medrash that says, this is why Ben Sira had a certain chachma, because he came from Yirmiyahu Hanavi, but it didn't reach the level of nevuah because it didn't come through the normal process of having a child. So that's what Ben Sira, Yehoshua Ben Sira. Okay. One interesting thing in Ben Sira, so Ben Sira is an early book, that means. If Ben Sira is said to be the son of Yirmiyahu Hanavi, That might have been a sefer that was even before the Churban. We don't know exactly. So in the book, however, he describes the righteousness of Shimon HaTzadik, who was one of the first Kohanim Gedolim of the second Beis HaMikdash. And do you know on Yom Kippur, when we read the Avodah of Yom Kippur during Musaf, the Yom Kippur service, so at the end we talk about how beautiful was the face of the Kohen Gadol when he would leave the Kodesh HaKadoshim, right? It's even a niggin that way. Like the radiance of the moon, like a chassan under the chuppah, like roses in a beautiful garden, right? And every time we say those things, Mareh Kohen, that is what the Kohen looked like. So the truth of the matter is, this part of the Machzor is actually a bit of an overly romantic depiction for the following reason. Theoretically, it could have been that way, and it should have been that way. Yeah, the Kedusha should have produced that. But Lamaisa, as you know, most of the Kohanim Gedolim of the second Beis HaMikdash were not righteous. Most of them, they didn't die in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, but they didn't live out the year. And often the Romans would auction it off to the highest bidder. So there were Mamish Rishonim who were Kohanim Gedolim. So this idea that they walked out of the Kodesh HaKadoshim and their face was shining with the radiance of the Shekhinah was often not true. But you know where that's taken from? That is actually taken from the book of Ben Sira, which is describing Shimon HaTzadik. So part of the book of Ben Sira is actually in our davening, because the description of the idealized Kohen Gadol is actually describing Shimon HaTzadik. And in Ben Sira he describes the righteousness. So again, the work is not Kaddish, but it is a legitimate work that one is allowed to look at. Yeah.
How did it work practically? I mean, did this woman know that she was impregnated from the mikveh? Did Ben Sira know that his father was Yirmiyahu? Did Yirmiyahu know he had a son?
It's very hard to know. I don't know the details. I mean, obviously she knew she was pregnant, and she must have figured out that it came from there. But how would you know? How would you know Bichlal? I mean, how would you know Bichlal? I mean, different people use the bathhouse. It could be 100 people, right? DNA testing was probably not available at that point. Did Yirmiyahu consider him his son? We Pasha don't know. But again, la halacha. Let me point out that the Meforshim assume, the Poskim assume, Yirmiyahu treated him as his son, and they bring a raya that Nesabra Biambati is considered your son, and you're Makayim Pru'ervu with it. And they bring a raya from Ben Sira. As far as I know, I have to check out, maybe my memory is not accurate here, I don't believe there is any other record of other children Yirmiyahu had. This literally may have been the only child that he had. I'll try to double check that, but I don't think there's any other children that are mentioned. Yeah. Yeah, so it really wasn't a mikveh, it was a bathhouse. And apparently men and women did use it, but not at the same time, meaning to say different times. But the problem is, you see, warm water, and this is actually true, and this is not an impossible thing to happen, that if there is some sperm in warm water is a medium that can keep sperm alive for a long time. So this is not, even in regular historical records, this is not a totally impossible thing. Yeah. Yeah, that's also a kasha, because the chara, even though people have seminal emissions, but normally we would assume that the greatest of the tzaddikim don't, just as Yaakov Avinu is praised, Laira Keri Miyamav. Why would it happen to Yirmiyahu? I don't know. Obviously it was an onus, and I guess maybe it was Hashgachas Pratis, that somehow Ben Sira's mother would be nisabra from this. So there was the Ratzon Hashem, so Hashem made reality such that it would happen. But normally you would not expect it to happen. By the way, I don't want to get too far in halachic issues, But this Ben Sira is the earliest makor for artificial insemination. Just to remind you of an interesting halachic controversy, the Satmar Rav had a very famous controversial psak in the 1960s that if a married woman gets inseminated from donor sperm, the kid is a mamzer. She's considered to commit adultery. She's a mamzer, and the husband is not allowed to stay married to his wife because she was mezaneh baratzin. This was the Satmar Rebbe's famous psak that use of donor sperm would mamish produce mamzeris, and it would answer her as Saita. Rav Moshe wrote 4 tshuvos, saying that there is no mamzeris without actual bia, and a woman is not neseres al baila without actual bia. Rav Moshe wrote 4 tshuvos. This elicited tremendous. I mean, there were Satmars, not the Rebbe, but there were Satmars who were burning Rav Moshe's Sefarim and burning him in effigy. So in his last tshuva, this is one of the strangest tshuvas, he actually writes that he's not chayzer, he's 100% right, but he withdraws his psak. It can't be used anymore. It's hard to know what that means even, because he says, B'dafka, this is my psak, but you're not allowed to use it. Right? Okay, maybe we'll talk a little bit more about it. But anyway, but the point is Ben Sira was the first recorded instance of artificial insemination, Nisab Rabbi Ambati. Taiser says that is why it's a book of Chachma, a book of musar, but because of the circumstances, it did not reach the darga of Nevuah, therefore it was excluded. It was treated as Sefarim Chitzonim.
Thank you for listening to this Awesome Ech production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.